China versus the United States. A war game predicted what would happen if the two went to war over Taiwan. Here is what it found. First, let me describe what a war game is before we get into the article. A war game is like a simulation of what would happen. It's like a guesstimate of what would happen if two or more countries went to war. In this case, what would happen if China went to war with the US over Taiwan? Let's get into the article. War game simulation predicts outcome of Taiwan conflict. Both US and Chinese forces would be crippled, a Washington think tank believes. An attempt by Beijing to take control of Taiwan by force in 2026, that's in 3 years, would likely be unsuccessful, CNN has reported, citing a war simulation conducted by a US think tank. Think tanks I am not a fan of. I think they are some of the worst influences on Washington policy and on policy in general. They all have tired and the same exhaustive approaches to policy. And so I'm not a fan of them. The ensuing conflict would not only cost Beijing dearly, but also the Taiwanese, US, and Japanese militaries, that analysis finds. And that's what America wants. America wants a weakened people. For example, in this case, a weakened Asians, and it doesn't care about collateral damage. Look at Iraq and Afghanistan. It wanted a weakened Iraq, a weakened Afghanistan. It didn't care about the people of either of those countries. And it's the same when Iran and Iraq went to war in the 1980s. And so America doesn't care about the collateral damage. It doesn't care about damaging or weakening any other peoples or nations, just so long as it gets what it wants and remains strong. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, report titled "The First Battle of the Next War" estimates that the U.S. would lose at least 2 aircraft carriers and that 3,200 American troops would be killed in 3 weeks of combat, according to CNN, which viewed an advanced copy of the analysis. The simulations, which were run 24 times, found that Taiwan survived as an autonomous entity in most scenarios, but with heavy losses to all parties. The United States and Japan lose dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of service members, the report predicts. China's navy would be left in shambles, and Beijing could lose 10,000 troops, 155 combat aircraft, and 138 major ships. Meanwhile, Taiwan's military would be severely degraded and left to defend an island without electricity and basic services. Japan could also lose approximately 100 aircraft and 26 warships, as U.S. bases on its territory come under attack from China. CSIS, which again stands for Center for Strategic and International Studies, it's a think tank, said such war is not inevitable or even probable, noting that Beijing could opt for a strategy of diplomatic isolation and economic coercion instead. Chinese President Xi Jinping has said Beijing's goal is peaceful reunification with the island, but has not ruled out force. The report notes there is no comparison between a Taiwan conflict and the crisis in Ukraine, because it would be impossible to get troops and supplies onto the island once a war begins. Whatever the Taiwanese are going to fight the war with, they have to have that when the war begins, CSIS said, arguing that Washington needed to fully arm Taipei, which is the capital of Taiwan, in advance. However, while the U.S. may win a Pyrrhic victory in Taiwan, it would end up suffering more in the long run than the defeated Chinese, the report concluded. Beijing views self-governing Taiwan as an integral part of its territory under the One China policy, which is acknowledged by the U.S., and opposes any form of diplomatic and military assistance to the government in Taipei. Chinese officials have accused Washington of deliberately eroding the long-standing arrangement by having close military cooperation with the island, which I agree. But it's not only limited to this, China and Taiwan. It expands across the globe. Look at Iran and Saudi Arabia. Look at Russia and the Ukraine. Look at various Latin American countries. Look at China and Japan, China and South Korea, China and the Philippines. The U.S. stands in the way of a lot of these possible relationships because it advances its own interests when it does so. And so that's been its policy for decades, because U.S. divides and conquers. That's what all of the major powers, including the U.S., have done, divide and conquer. Unfortunately, the United States is no exception. And so it's been able to interlope its way into a lot of these regions and the potential relationships that could have taken place had it not butted in. President Joe Biden has twice promised U.S. military support in the event of a Chinese invasion. First in May and again in September, White House officials have walked back those statements, however, stating that the U.S. is not encouraging Taiwanese independence. So the article mentioned a Pyrrhic victory. If the U.S. won, it would win a Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhic victory means you win the war, but the losses are so damaging, it's as if you lost the war. And so in this report, and in this study, they found that the U.S. would win a Pyrrhic victory against the Chinese, that it would suffer in the long run than the defeated Chinese would. And so I found that part of the report and the study interesting. But Americans, they don't want to hear that kind of stuff. They don't want to hear that they'll lose. They don't want to hear the losses, the casualties. They don't care about that. They love war. Americans and America are addicted to war, unfortunately. The military-industrial complex has them fiending like addicts. And so I don't think any of that is going to make a difference to any of them. And they're not rational. Americans in general are not irrational people. What they love violence so much so that they'll enact violence in order to get their way. They're not up to rational dialogue and discussions. But I found that Pyrrhic victory part of the article interesting. But my views are ultimately the United States should mind its business. It needs to butt out of Chinese affairs. It needs to butt out of Russian affairs. It needs to butt out of the affairs of the Middle East. It's made things worse in the Middle East. It needs to butt out of the affairs of Latin America and so on. And so by, continuing to carry out these military expeditions in the South China Sea specifically, since we're talking about a war game simulation between China and the U.S., it's only provoked China. The U.S. has only provoked China with these military adventures out in the South China Sea. And so what would you expect? If you continue to poke a bear, you're going to eventually get bit. But that's what the U.S. wants. It wants to war with China so that it can weaken it. It wants to go head in head. It's like the bully in the yard. It wants to fight anybody, especially anybody who poses a potential threat to it in the future, economically, politically, and so on. And so it wants to fight anybody in the yard. And that's what it's been trying to do with Russia. That's what it's been trying to do with China. We talked about in another video a unipolar world and how that was terrible for the entire world, having only the United States as a unipolar power, how dangerous that was. And so it sees a rising China and it wants to stifle its growth. But let me know what you guys think. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, leave a like, leave a comment. Let me know what you guys think. Should the U.S. go to war with China? Do you believe the U.S. is going to war with China? Do you agree with the article in the study that found that it would be a Pyrrhic victory in which the U.S. would suffer so much that the cost of war wouldn't be worth it against China? What do you guys think? Do you hope peace? Leave a comment in the comment section. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Leave a like. If you're listening to this on the podcast, tweet me. Let me know what you think about all of this. Take care.